2 weeks ago I'd never even seen a float plane. Now myself and a team of 3 others were trapped on a small, sandy island in the far north of Labrador subarctic tundra, crossing our fingers that we'd make it back to our extraction point a day's paddle upriver, where we hope to find a turbo otter waiting to pluck us off a small, nondescript lake and return us home to civilization. It's times like this that make me wonder why we'd all fought so hard to get there. Why we'd spent over a year of late nights poring over topo maps and dreaming of frost-covered tents and dark, boulder-strewn rivers. The truth was that we were chasing after a fish that swims through all of our dreams yet is fading quickly from our home waters. We were on one hell of an adventure, and we were just getting started. When I was 10, my grandfather put a fly rod in my hands. A gesture that significance would take me decades to understand. That singular pursuit, breaching the contract between air and water in search of the mysterious, fleeting creatures that lie beneath, has done more to shape me into the person I am today than anything else. It's taken me to a lot of places, and I've seen a lot of fish, but none have left an impact on me as great as the first. A species which I would later introduce as the first to my wife Amy as well. And a fascination which would spark a love affair that has spanned the rest of our lives and lead us down a path we could have never predicted. That fish is Salvelinus fontinalis, the brook trout. Not a true trout, the brook trout is a species of char, a similar though distinct genus of salmonid. Certain characteristics like light spots against a dark body and white piping along the leading edges of the fins are typical of char, but even amongst its close relatives, the brook trout's vibrant beauty stands in a league of its own. It's no wonder that for 400 years, the inhabitants of North America and the indigenous peoples before them have held these fish in high regard, considering them the most beautiful of all freshwater fish. In some cases, like the tribes of the Six Nations, brook trout were considered sacred and never eaten. But as European expansion and colonization reached the continent, a grim reality was soon to play out. For what the natives spared, the New World would destroy by the millions. Brook trout once thrived from the Great Lakes south to Georgia and north to Hudson Bay, but habitat degradation and fragmentation, acid rain, overfishing, climate change, and the introduction of non-native species have pushed this delicate indicator species to the brink. Now extirpated from more than half of their historic range, the remnant populations are often stunted and poorly adapted to environmental fluctuation due to watered-down genetics from inferior hatchery stock. As the very first game fish encountered by the settlers, it's easily argued that there's no more quintessentially American fish than the brook trout. Yet apathy, poor management, and destructive practices are on track to see it disappear entirely from the landscape. Though a nuanced issue, one undeniable truth about the health of brook trout populations throughout the East is that where people go, destruction is sure to follow. Like most with an interest in native species, we've spent countless afternoons sitting along the edge of our local streams, imagining what things may have been like before the European settlers had arrived. When fish over 10 inches were not only common, they were abundant in a way that for contemporary anglers is hard to fathom. There's really only one place left on Earth where brook trout have thrived almost entirely unadulterated for the last 10,000 years. Labrador, a place referred to by the natives as simply the Big Land. For more than a decade, I've fantasized about making it to the Labrador Peninsula, a place that still to this day is largely unexplored. With half of the under 30,000 inhabitants concentrated to 2 small cities, the rest of the over 100,000 square miles of raw wilderness sees very little human traffic. At the turn of the 20th century, Labrador was rich with harrowing tales of adventure and hardship, as both foreign and domestic men and women began to map its vast interior. Sweltering heat and unimaginable hordes of biting insects in the short summer months make travel hard on a landscape comprised of either wet bogs and muskeg or glacially scoured razor-sharp metamorphic rock. The bitter cold of a 9-month Arctic winter makes serious travel unthinkable the rest of the year. Today, Labrador is still largely roadless, but the advent of modern aerial and satellite imaging technology have helped fill in the empty maps of the late 1800s, though some estimate that over 50% of the province's lakes and rivers have still never been paddled or fished. In fact, the fly fishing world at large would know very little about this vast expanse until the 1950s, when famed angler and pilot Lee Wolf began his historic exploration of the interior's pristine waters.
Dreams have wings, and so do the seaplanes that carry anglers into the heart of the northern wilderness.
At the time, Lee had landed what is arguably the greatest job of all time, scouting off-base recreational opportunities for American Air Force personnel stationed at Goose Bay.
And here, where no one has ever fished before, the seaplane pilot can take his choice of the best brook trout waters of the North American continent.
With a 16mm camera and a single-engine float plane, Lee would discover the greatest brook trout fisheries the world has ever known, and pioneer the methods and equipment still used to catch them to this day. Soon, names like Minipie, Eagle, and Adlatock were on the tips of all brook trout anglers' tongues, and lavish sporting camps with modern amenities sprung up throughout the region, giving sportsmen the opportunity to explore Atlantic Canada's wilderness for themselves.
The brook trout in this little-fished river are consistently between 3 and 5 pounds. An angler's dream, all right, and one that could only come true in Labrador.
Labrador's government is taking great care as well, to ensure that tourism-based sport fishing and hunting is closely managed, because the province's greatest appeal, its wilderness, if mismanaged, could easily become its own greatest threat. These laws would be our first real hurdle to overcome if we wanted to enter the Labrador wilds on our own. "15 years ago, an accomplished angler and outdoor writer by the name of Eddie Nickens published an article in Field and Stream magazine that turned more than a few heads. Him and 3 of his fishing buddies had returned from an exploratory mission to the headwaters of one of Labrador's longest and most remote river systems, the Kanariktok. They'd followed a rumor from some caribou hunters who tossed a line in while waiting on a float plane pickup and allegedly caught massive brook trout by the bucketful. They mounted a week-long expedition to the area and discovered that the rumors were not only true, but barely scratched the surface. What they found could only be described as a brook trout nirvana, where fish are measured in pounds rather than inches, and are more likely to feed on flies resembling rodents than insects. Since then, no one had returned to pick up where they left off, and the fishery plunged back into obscurity. It's incredibly rare as a filmmaker to have the opportunity to be the first to document something, and after speaking with Eddie myself, I knew we had to find a way to get back there. The The indigenous people of Labrador, the Inuit, Innu, and Naskapi, have lived and traveled the barren expanse of the peninsula for centuries using the most efficient and elegant form of transportation available, the canoe. We knew if we were to be successful, we'd need to do the same. The canoe would become more than just a tool. It would be our home, our companion. There was only one problem. We didn't know anything about paddling.
I'm headed downtown to send my letter.
Entering a landscape as treacherous as Labrador unprepared could mean the literal difference between life and death. So we learned the only way we knew how, by plunging headfirst into the world of canoe expeditioning, completing over 100 miles of travel over 10 days on Maine's Allagash Wilderness Waterway. We learned quickly that without a canoe, it would be impossible to travel and transport the necessary gear to survive several weeks in the bush. We were students of our failures, and trial by fire eventually saw us improving day by day, paddle stroke by paddle stroke. Labrador fishing regulations require non-residents to fish exclusively with a licensed guide present, and to engage the services of an outfitter in doing so. It was one thing to mobilize some friends and adventure junkies on the trip of a lifetime, but finding a working professional and virtual stranger to agree to leave dry cabins, home-cooked meals, and big tipping clients for 2 weeks of hard camping in the bush would be like finding a needle in a haystack. We searched relentlessly for months, and after countless dead ends, when all else seemed hopeless and the expedition appeared destined for failure, we found that needle. A young Nova Scotian named Chris Sinclair, who'd spent the better part of his adult life guiding at Labrador's most esteemed lodges, answered the call and agreed to follow us into the unknown. We'd later find out how lucky we were when Chris confided in us that word of our expedition was getting around, and no other guides wanted to touch it with a 10-foot stick. Though we'd gone from novice to experienced paddlers in a few short months, we knew our gear would need to be significantly strengthened and improved before taking on the taiga. An emergency on the Allagash was one thing. Though sparse, there was other human traffic, designated campsites, private roadways, and even park rangers who could give aid in case of an emergency. But in Labrador, we knew we'd be the only human beings for 1,000 square miles, and if weather was bad or communication was down, it could be days before help would reach us. Most paddlers will consult local river data for flow rates and water temperatures before embarking on a trip, but the wilderness offered us no such luxury. We gleaned what we could from scouring satellite imagery and topo maps, but had to prepare for the worst. Areas that Eddie had recalled as dried-up boulder fields were marked as mile-long rapids on our maps. We made the decision to outfit our canoes with spray decks, a custom-sewn vinyl tarp that laces over the top of a canoe and serves to keep the paddlers dry and warm, with an added benefit of reducing drag from wind and simultaneously trapping air and gear in the event of a flip. We still had one problem. Our team was 3 and we needed a 4th to round out the tandem canoes. Luckily, we knew just who to call. Our friend Dylan Markey, a certified brook trout nut and seasoned whitewater rafting guide, had spent years planning a trip of his own to Labrador, but unable to cobble a crew together, he'd all but given up hope of making it there. We knew Dylan's whitewater experience would be a major asset for our ragtag team of first-time expeditioners. He didn't take much convincing either, going so far as to defer a year of med school to fulfill his dreams of chasing big brookies and running rapids in Labrador.
looks like when you're sitting inside there.
We had our gear, our crew, and our route. The only thing left to do was get ourselves there, a feat that would prove to be an adventure all its own. We needed to make it to Schefferville, a small mining outpost in northern Quebec, nestled just over a mile from the Labrador border in the heart of Naskapi and Innu territories. Established in the 1950s, the town served as a hub for extracting the rich iron ore deposits characteristic of the region, but when mining operations grinded to a halt in 1982, the town was literally wiped off the map. Today the mines are once again working, but Schefferville still wears the scars of its tumultuous past. For us, it serves as the nearest point of civilization from which to mount our expedition. With no roads leading in or out, our only choice to get ourselves, our gear, and canoes there safely was to ride the twice-a-week, dawn-till-dusk train starting in the coastal town of Sept-Îles, Quebec, where we'd rendezvous with Christopher. But first we had to make it there, which meant 16 hours and nearly 1,000 miles of travel by car stuffed to the ceiling with gear. Chuiten means north wind in Innu, a fitting name to describe the 350-mile exodus through some of the most remote and pristine wilderness in all of North America. Despite the length of the railway, it never once passes through another town and serves as the primary lifeline to connect both the northern communities with civilization and provide a vehicle for the southern-dwelling Innu and Naskapi to return to and connect with their ancestral lands and heritage. Frequented by paddlers and explorers in the summer months, we were only the most recent in a long line of adventurers to make the journey. Our pilot, Sam Paquette, whose family has owned and operated sporting camps along the George River in northern Quebec for 35 years, was waiting for us when we arrived in Schefferville. Before we could even catch our breath, our canoes and cargo were off the train and in Sam's bus, where we sped off into the night down a winding gravel road we took on faith would lead to his airbase. Weather in the north is a fickle thing. We paced around anxiously waiting for reports from a nearby mining camp stationed between us and our destination. We were transporting our canoes externally on the plane's floats, where even a light wind could prove deadly. Decisions are made by a combination of sourced information and gut feelings, and any bush pilot worth their salt knows there's no substitution for a man on the ground, even with the advent of modern weather imaging technology. When the call finally came, the plane was loaded in a flash, and without a moment to think or change our minds, we were off. As we neared the Kanariktok, it was immediately clear that things weren't going to go as we'd planned. The water was low, and the lakes, which looked deep and full on the maps, were clear, shallow, and rocky. Our drop-off point was out of the question. We flew over our route to the proposed extraction point, which also proved unsafe to land. A lake in the middle held the most promise, and a split decision was made. We'd land there and traverse up and down the system. Traveling against the current is never your first choice, but we'd come too far to give up, so we all agreed to make it happen. As Sam disappeared out of sight, it finally hit us. We were completely and utterly alone. We decided to make camp and save our energy for the morning when we pushed downstream. After some searching, we'd found a suitable spot between boulders and bogs, enough to fit our tents and huddle around a small fire. We fished for several hours that evening, but only managed one fish, a 15-inch female. It was an exciting confirmation that the area indeed held trout, but we were all feeling a little nervous about how little was yielded from such promising water. Had we come all this way to discover the fishery had disappeared years ago? We decided to stay put and fish hard before moving on. Maybe our technique was to blame, or the conditions. But the following day didn't bring any fish either. We knew from Eddie's notes that where we'd landed, the middle of our route, was the end of theirs, and by his recollection, the peak of their fishing success as well. It certainly looked the part. How could it be that we were coming up empty-handed? Had Eddie made the story up? Had there been some sort of ecological collapse? A lot can happen in 15 years. Maybe we were too late. That evening, as we prepared dinner, we had our first brush with catastrophe.
I got my hand.
A lapse in concentration while I was cording firewood sent us into emergency action.
Can you apply a little bit of pressure on you guys?
The blade had narrowly missed severing major veins and tendons, and under any other circumstances would have required a trip to the ER and some stitches. Given the dangers of infection from a procedure like that in the bush, we opted to flush the wound thoroughly and field dress it in hopes that it might close on its own. We were only 2 days in, and the thought of having to evacuate now because of my own absent-mindedness was more than any of us could bear. We knew we couldn't stay in one spot any longer, and if we were going to have any shot at finding fish, we'd have to move.
Into mazes of small talk when the morning comes. Still the same old reflection of the same old sun, telling tales of our travels. Still the same old song. We'll find our way back before the summer's gone. Do you remember the far back?
We traveled through a number of lakes and ponds, spilling into each other by a series of narrow chutes before it even really resembles a river.
The wind settled down.
Every new corner we turned, our hopes would rise with the prospect of finding fish, but time and time again we'd come up empty-handed.
Spring rise, still get fooled by the first light and the first blue sky. Looking down our old dirt road till clouds arise, hide
were there to document the fishery, but knowing that every time we stepped out of our canoes we'd be the first to plant our feet there was becoming reward in and of itself. The thought of fish became almost secondary as the river picked up steam and Dylan put us all through a whitewater clinic. Marked the end of the headwaters, and below was countless miles of dangerous rapids and deep canyons. He was like a gatekeeper, there to remind us we'd come too far. Travel any farther and we'd never make it back to our extraction point. This was strange behavior for an animal that had never seen a human being before, and we knew better than to push our luck. The rest of the afternoon, he paced the perimeter of the lake, forcing us to camp on an island we'd spend the next several days trapped on, bound by wind and rain. We'd grown addicted to seeing new country, and the long, dull days with no travel were maddening. After 3 days, we knew we had to move. When the 60-mile-an-hour headwinds died down to 20, we made our push. We'd travel the full length of our route, upstream, navigating the rapids we'd shot days earlier, only this time on foot, dragging and hauling our gear through the slippery boulders. We pushed past our extraction point and onwards to new water. As the days slipped past, our hopes of finding fish diminished. We didn't care. We knew we were a part of something special, something we'd remember for the rest of our lives. Our outfit was now running like a well-oiled machine. We could set up and break camp in a matter of minutes, and pack the canoes even faster. We'd started fishing less during our pit stops and marveling more at the outstretched country in front of us. could travel 100 miles in every direction and not find another human being. But something wasn't right. We couldn't shake this nagging feeling that the fish had to be there. Years of collective experience told us the environment was too perfect not to hold fish. How had Aimee landed that first fish on day 1? Was it the only fish in the entire system? Then, suddenly and all at once, on a day no different than any other, and on a piece of water indistinguishable from the rest, everything changed. The fish were here. We'd found them. Moments earlier, the river had seemed barren, but now it was teeming with life more bountiful than we could have imagined.
Everything you live for pours down the mud. Broken leg, I lay here, lost in flood.
The fish were abundant and hungry, feeding in a frenzy on mouse patterns in the midday sun. The rain and wind, the bear, the axe wound, the long days of travel all suddenly seemed a million miles away. We'd made it. We'd found a brook trout paradise after all.
I know I must do this. Come on, little one. No, we want to find you. We live on and on. And when I'm naked,
Berries all over the ground.
Labrador had offered us an opportunity to peel back the layers of time and briefly experience a life less complicated and conflicted by the burdens of the modern world.
Thank you for feeding us.
Yeah, thank you, man.
That was just a Christmas piece. That's what
We were living in close contact with the land, slowly aligning its rhythms with our own.
You like it?
It's like shaking.
Good job, Amy. How hard you can.
I start tossing this red and black wet fly and
As our departure date neared, we kept a close eye on the weather. We knew that unless we found a window of ideal conditions, we'd have to abandon our canoes. If we waited it out, we risked missing our train home. We confirmed over sat phone with Sam that we had a shot at 7 a.m. the following morning, a day early. Even though we'd been in the bush for nearly 2 weeks, it felt like we were just getting started. Hey, wake up. You gotta come see this.
Raindrops like bullets on my fragile skin, insecurities.
As we sped away from the Kanariktok, I felt a sense of sadness, like saying goodbye to an old friend. The truth was that we were all mourning the loss of a part of ourselves. We'd left a little piece out there, with the spruce and the tamarack. Maybe we'd be reunited one day, maybe we wouldn't, but I feel a tremendous amount of comfort knowing that whether I'm there or not, the place will persist, just as it has for thousands of years. And long after I'm gone, those big predatory brook trout will patrol the tannin depths like transient ghosts.
Your teeth.
some ways, it's a miracle that places like Labrador still exist in North America. But with resources running thin and a rapidly changing climate, there's no guarantee that they'll stay that way forever. Just a few miles west across the border of Quebec, the largest resource extraction and economic development project in Canadian history is underway, the Plan Nord. It hopes to bring roads, commerce, and tourism to the otherwise virgin boreal forest. It's been met with strong opposition from the Innu, but their voices continue to be stifled. I used to think that the answer to preserving wilderness was to keep people away from it, but now I know that's not right either. Human beings have been a part of this landscape for millennia, but we're also its greatest threat. The problem lies in the way we view the land, as a resource to be developed and managed, all the while missing its greatest value. We ask how the land is being used and what we can do to increase its productivity. Human expansion paints with broad brushes, rarely stopping to think of the intrinsic cultural and spiritual value that wilderness has. Maybe it's our inability to describe the intangible benefits of time spent in wild places. We have no metric to express the ways we grow and are enriched by the experience of wilderness immersion. Or perhaps it's simply a skill that's been lost, a skill that can be relearned through time spent in the woods, along ancient shores, or under a primordial moon. With a place as incredible as the Kanariktok headwaters remaining relatively unknown, there's surely untold numbers of lakes and rivers of equal splendor scattered across the vast subarctic tundra of Labrador. It's up to us to make sure they don't go silently into the night under the unrelenting machines of development and industry. Having explored only a drop in the vast ocean of the province's fresh water, there was really only one question left. Where to next?
Into the pace of the oldest saints, I came to harvest my wasteland dream. So this is how it all must have been before the new world arrived. Don't mind the stains, they will go away. I never felt water this way. I think I needed thoughts to appear. Well, I see farther out here, over rocks and sand, through a barren land. From all we've done, lonely river on the run. Drifting down through an ancient view, heavy clouds over hills in blue. I'll keep the map somewhere safe and dry to brighten my northern sky. Over rocks and sand, through a barren land. After all we've done, a lonely river on the run. Heavy clouds over hills in blue. I'll keep the map somewhere safe and dry to brighten my northern sky. Over rocks and sand, through a barren land. After all we've done, a lonely river on the run.